Saying of the day is from Robert Frost. Freedom is being bold. Without courage, you're going to lose freedom. And Frost emphasized that and made me think of something that happened some time ago back in 78, 79, and 80. And that's when the Iranians were struggling for freedom. The Shah of Iran, Pavlik family, their crown prince came to Lubbock and was taking flying lessons at Reese Air Force Base and was enrolled in some Texas Tech courses. And he was learning to fly, and it was a big deal. He had a real nice house in Lubbock, and he was doing well. And then in 78, I got elected on November the 7th, 1978. And that was on a Tuesday. And on Thursday, the Chamber of Commerce was having a deal that George Mahon was going out as congressman. He had been chairman of appropriations for 18 years. And that he was going out, and that they had Ambassador Zahedi from Iran coming in for the Chamber of Commerce banquet to recognize Mahon, and Henry Kissinger was going to speak. So it's a big deal, and it's come up the next week. And I got a call a couple of days after the election, one from a CIA guy and one from a State Department. And then I realized these agencies don't talk to each other many times. And they both wanted me to, be around the ambassador and the crown prince and see what their attitude was, because there were demonstrations going on in Iran, and the demonstrations had anywhere from 100,000 people to 1 million people. It's hard to get 1 million people to show up for anything, even if you're giving free food and drink. And so they wanted me to do that. And like I say, I realized that they must not be talking to each other, or just one would have called. And I visited with them, the Crown Prince and Ambassador Zahedi, and had a good visit with him, with both, and with Ambassador Zahedi in particular. He was the ambassador to the United States for Iran. Now, his dad had been a general under the Shah back in the 50s, and he had gone to school at Utah State. His dad wanted to get him an ag degree and figured Utah State was a good place. And he went there, pledged Kappa Sig. It's kind of funny that, a guy's going to, be in a fraternity, and he's a foreign student. And as a distinguished alum of the Kappa Sig, he has since passed on. But he was there. He had been ambassador to Great Britain in the early 50s after the CIA joined with the Shah and overthrew the government that they had. And after that, he was ambassador to the United States, and then he had some director of foreign affairs for Iran. Then he came back as ambassador in the 70s to the United States. He was a charming guy. He said the right thing at the right time, and he was smooth. He was really buddies with Elizabeth Taylor. Everywhere you saw her back in the 70s, he was, along with her. And I don't know if they had a romantic relationship or not, but he was always close by. And that he ran with the movie stars, the top diplomats, the president, and he was riding pretty high. And I asked him how things were in Iran, those demonstrations. Nothing, just some students that are crazy, just a small amount of students. Well, the press has been reporting 100,000 to 1 million. And so I thought he was whistling through the graveyard, and it turns out he was. And they overthrew the government, and the Shah of Iran, which is king, he'd been called the Shah name, went back to the 1500s. And he was the king, and he fled, wound up in Mexico for a while. Then he got cancer, and they brought him to the United States, and I'll touch on that just in a minute. And wound up in Egypt. President Sadat in Egypt took him in. And so the students when the U.S. when Jimmy Carter gave him asylum to come to Sloan Kettering for Institute for Cancer and Cancer Research and Cancer Hospital, and that's where he was staying. The students, supposedly the students, but I think it was the leaders that had taken over for the Shah, were really mad that the U.S. was taking him in, and so the students took over the U.S. Embassy. And any of us that are old enough, we remember that. It was just a huge deal. They captured 60-something people and found out there were some of them that were not Americans, and they let them go. But they had about 53 U.S. citizens and held them for 444 days. And they went through grave psychological treatment. And I've never heard much about any of them since they got back. I mean, they were really low key. And they'd have a trial at the embassy and give them the death penalty. Tell them they're going to execute it next week. Mm. The next week would come and they said, well, we're putting it off a few days. You know, and they just played mind games with them, had them always in fear, and physically abused them some, but the mental abuse was by far the worst. And Jimmy Carter, as president, he authorized a plan where they would go in, U.S. military, into Tehran and free those hostages, get them out. And I could have told you if somebody had asked me, they certainly didn't ask me, that when you're talking about a city of millions of people, that's going to be a hard deal to go in and get them out. And anyway, they flew into the desert, and they had a couple of C-130s, and then they had some helicopters. During the operation, they had a dust storm, and it messed up some of the engines. It was such a dust storm, they should have been practicing that in Lubbock in about March, you know. And they had some miscommunication, and one of the helicopters ran into one of the C-130s, and it killed 8 U.S. servicemen. But it was really an embarrassment to the United States. And the Secretary of State, Cy Vance, resigned over it. And Warren Christopher, who was a pretty good guy, took his place. And President Carter never recovered. I think that had that been successful and they'd pulled it off, he'd have probably been reelected. Mm-hmm. But he never recovered. And Reagan played a smart deal. He didn't beat him over the head with it all the time or anything. He kind of let the story take place on its own. And he and Jimmy Baker and George Bush came up with that strategy. And they you know, just kind of let President Carter get beat by himself, essentially what happened. But it was a big deal, and ABC started a night, they cast it at 10:30 about the hostages every night, 5 nights a week. And so it stayed in the forefront of the American people. And then when we tried to get them out, we couldn't. I think a lot of people thought they were disappointed in that our military wasn't as good a shape as it should be. And it wasn't. And Reagan beefed it up when he got into office. But the weather was a big part of it. They hadn't anticipated that. Well, if you're going to fly into the desert, there's a good chance there's going to be a dust storm. And those helicopters, they were taking on so much dirt, it just shut down the engines on some of them. They couldn't fly them. And so it became, instead of a strategic method to get our hostages out of there, it became a mission of trying to save the people that had gone in there to make the difference.
What was the mood in Congress after that? You were there.
Well, mood in Congress was kind of, and Carter just passed away within the last few months, and I always liked him as an individual, but he was in over his head. And I think the people in Congress all sensed that. Mm-hmm. And that he'd have been a good president of the school board in Plains, Georgia, but there's a big jump to president. Maybe okay in Georgia. I do have to give him the Camp David Accords, he did it right, and it was very good, and that was a step in the right direction. But planning, I don't know how you're going to get out of downtown Tehran with 2 or 3 million people. How are you going to get those, so you go in the middle of the night? Is there one person in that 3 million that's going to say, look, there's something, they're moving the people out and moving the hostages out. So, I don't think that they had any idea. Now, there were about 6 hostages, or 6 people that would have become hostages, but they were away from the embassy when it happened. And U.S. CIA went in and got them and found them and got them out of there. Ross Perot helped on that with the CIA. And later, he got so crossways with President Bush that they never did heal that. That was on the prisoners of war.
Do you think Ross Perot ran for president just so President Bush wouldn't win?
I think that was one of the reasons that he thought maybe he could ignite the American public and win. But if he couldn't win, he's going to make sure that Bush didn't.
Yeah. What was their issue? Do you know?
And their issue was on prisoners of war, and that Perot thought that Bush ignored him and wouldn't help him with getting prisoners out, and it became a personal issue. And Bush easy to get along with. Perot is the kind of guy that if he didn't get his way, he wasn't real happy. He was a strong person, strong individual, and he felt like he knew what needed to be done to find the prisoners of war in Vietnam and Cambodia, and he felt like that Bush just blew him off and ignored him. The TV show I mentioned was Nightline, and it went on and on for years and changed other things. Ted Koppel, Ted Koppel reporting, he always had some report. But it's hard to have a 30-minute story every night for over a year about the same subject. Ronald Reagan knew what was going on as a presidential nominee. He got briefed. And the U.S., Christopher Warren, Secretary of State, had established some ties with Algeria. And Algeria was the one that was negotiating with the Iranians, trying to get the hostages out. And they finally worked it out. And they got them out, and they were released when Reagan was sworn in. And President Carter flew to West Germany to meet him and congratulate him. And President Reagan sent messages, and it ended something that the funny thing about it, the Ayatollah Khomeini was running the country, and a lot of the people that demonstrated, and I had some friends from Iran, they said they were on the demonstrators' side because the Shah was, he was way too overwhelming power-wise and provided no freedom. And so they thought this new group would be better. Well, they were worse. They don't allow anything. And they have not been able to have any type of freedom. The Iranians that live here in the United States, they've got radio stations in Southern California. They've got so many people that have their own radio station. And but they're freedom-loving people, and some of them are really great business people and made a lot of money in business. But what happens when you lose economic freedom and other freedoms? The best people get out first. In China, the best people in China headed to Taiwan, and they were able to set up businesses that have done extremely well. So when the people that have the ability to escape a dictator or a communist party or something like that, they get out pretty fast. They don't wait around. And those are the smartest people, and they're going to go into business in your country, and they're going to do well, extremely well. There were some other things that happened. The Crown Prince was living in Lubbock, as I said.
Can I ask you a quick question about that?
Sure.
Why Lubbock?
Reese Air Force Base.
Oh, he's learned to fly.
Yeah, he was learning to fly, and Ambassador Zahedi had talked to Congressman Mahon, and he encouraged him to come to Reese, and he could go and get some classes at Texas Tech at the same time. So he was learning to fly T-38s, and he lived on 21st, about 3 houses down from the chancellor's house when I was chancellor. And some students from Southern California came to Lubbock. This is really a funny story. To demonstrate against him. They got a parade permit, and so they were demonstrating in front of his house, but they took a wrong turn and went down the wrong street. They was demonstrating in front of houses that, didn't have anything to do with it. And the chief of police then was a guy named J.T. Alley. J.T. is a friend of mine. He was a no-nonsense guy. And they got off on the wrong street, and he just had them all arrested. And so after that one time they got on the wrong street and everything, they never did come back.
That was it.
They'd seen all the Lubbock they wanted. And so it was a unusual situation to have demonstrations in a neighborhood in Lubbock, Texas. And that house sat there for years upon years with no one in it because couldn't get a title on it. The Iranian government owned it, and they wouldn't give a title. They wouldn't sign off on a deed, any kind of deed. And they just ignored it. So he just sat there.
Huh. It's unusual.
Yeah. And it was a nice house, a very expensive house. And that Crown Prince was a nice young man, very polite, and he's still alive. But Ambassador Zahedi, he died in 2006 in Switzerland, and he fled to Switzerland and lived there for the rest of his life and avoided anything in the Middle East.
You mentioned earlier, speaking about moving around, the Shah ended up in Egypt. You said we'd come back to that.
Yeah. I talked to Warren Christopher, who was Secretary of State, and about that there was a ranch, a guy in Lubbock named Chuck Seward. He was a pipeliner. He had bought out R.H. Fulton in the pipelining business.
One of our favorites.
And one of our favorite stories, R.H. Fulton. Go back in the library and look that one up.
Yeah.
He's worth a listen. And Chuck Seward said at the time, told me that they could have his ranch, if they wanted it, and it'd be close to the medical school and the hospital and everything. And I got the ranch was in 4 counties. It's a big ranch. And got the sheriffs in and talked to them about it and, see if they cared, and they didn't care, and so we told the State Department. But the State Department got so much heat letting them be in New York, they wanted them out, and they went to Mexico, and then they wound up in Egypt. Sadat was a strong guy. He was a strong leader, and he took them when no one else would take them. And then the Shah died in Egypt.
The thought of living in exile is kind of a weird thing, isn't it?
It happens.
Yeah.
It happens all the time. Different leaders living in exile. Napoleon had to live in exile for a while. Lots of times they're afraid if they let you live in exile that you'll try to get organized and come back and take over. So instead of living in exile, they just kill you, And if they gave me the choice of living in exile or, getting killed, I'd say, I promise you, I'll stay right there. I'm not going to leave. I'll be on time every day, whatever time you tell me to show up at the salute of the flag or whatever you want me to do.
That's good. Later today, I'm going to Google leaders that ended up living in exile.
I'd like to know. Sometime next week we might talk about it. But there's been a lot of them.
There has.
A lot of them. And they can't go to their home, and they have to live in a different country and under a lot of rules and regulations. And the country that accepts them has to promise that they're going to make sure that they don't do something to try to organize and overthrow the present government.
Boy, that'd be something if you're in exile and you did do that.
Oh, that has happened before.
It has. Really?
Yeah, it has. I'll look that up, and maybe we'll talk about it next week. But living in exile and kind of getting loose and getting organized and getting your army and marching back.
It's just in your blood, I guess, if that's what you're doing.
You're glutton for punishment.
You really are. I'll do some
knowing that if you try a second time, they're not going to give you exile the next time.
No.
They're just going to kill you.
Yeah.
Another thing about this time in April in 1989, this is something everyone will remember. I was in Vienna, Austria at the time, going to an OPEC meeting. And I was in my hotel room and I was watching TV, and it showed this guy walking out in front of a tank in China, Tiananmen Square. Mm-hmm. And I don't know who it was. They don't know. And somebody said, I don't know what happened to him. I got a feeling I know what happened to him. But they didn't shoot him on the spot. He stopped that tank, mm-hmm. and was an inspiration throughout China and throughout the world. And you had hundreds of thousands and millions that demonstrated. But the Chinese did much like they did in Hong Kong. They waited them out and gradually picked off one by one and charged them some crime. And there were a lot of demonstrations about freedom in Hong Kong, but you don't hear anything anymore. Mm-hmm. It's over. The Chinese have complete control, and they're going to keep it that way. And that's the only way they see to govern, is to have complete control of an area.
You say that they took them one by one. Are you talking about the leaders, the organizers of the revolt in Tiananmen Square?
Yeah. They got them one after another. They didn't go out and try to arrest 100,000 people. Mm-hmm. They waited till it cooled off and people got back to their job or something before they'd start arresting them left and right. And then what happened, no one really knows.
Right.
But there's a lot of feeling that they probably didn't survive.
Talk about a historic image of that one person standing in front of that tank in Tiananmen Square. I mean, that's a photo that will burn into your mind forever. I watched it that day in Vienna, and I was like, wow. Mm-hmm. And you have to be bold. Robert Frost, mm-hmm. if you're going to have freedom, you have to be bold. And that guy was bold. Yeah, he was.
And stopped it, and probably later lost his life over it. But it was a change in the attitude, and something that happened after that in China is they got more economic freedom, and they started stressing economic freedom. And they do that now because there's a lot of the leaders, they have an opportunity to make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And so they don't complain as much. And, the Chinese, the greatest worry they have, in my opinion, is not Taiwan or not the United States. It's their own people having a revolution someday. And that's what scares them the most, in my opinion.
There's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. And if they start coming after you, they got enough people that'll last forever, 1.4 billion, something like that. I still go back to, and I've used it on the program before, Tommy Prothro. There was the football coach at UCLA. They were playing Southern Cal, and he was going to start Gary Beeman. It was his first year to be eligible. And he noticed during warm-ups that Beeman's eyes weren't blinking. He was a little scared. So he got Beeman over to the side, and he said, just remember this. No matter what happens today, there's over 1 billion people in China that don't care. And the kid laughed, and he laughed. And he later won the Heisman Trophy. Yeah. I always thought it was a pretty good story that, and he was right.
Yeah.
It might be something big to him on certain times, but, freedom of the U.S. or a football game in the U.S. wasn't going to be on their list. Also, about 40 years ago, 1985, Coca-Cola came out with a new idea called a New Coke. And the challenge Pepsi had been gaining a little, but they were still number one, mm-hmm. Coca-Cola. And so they decided doing all these tests, and they wanted to make it a little sweeter. And the result was that they decided that, and they had all these independent tests, that they would drop the Coke and go with a New Coke. It'd be a little sweeter. People drink more of them. And they announced it, and it set off a firestorm. And there were people that said, it tastes better, but I don't want to give up my old Coca-Cola. And the emotional thing, they did not factor in the emotions. Mm-hmm. And so finally, after about 3 or 4 months, they finally gave up and said, no more. We're going back to the old Coca-Cola. And people had gone around buying up a lot of the old Coca-Cola so that they'd have a chance to drink those later. And they've come back with, since then, different, the Diet Coke and the sugar-free Coke and things like that. It's one of the worst marketing disasters of the century. Mm-hmm. And they came out of it finally okay, but they were having real problems. They had emergency board meetings, seemed like around the clock, trying to figure out what to do.
The old saying applies, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
Why change it? You're number one in sales. You're selling more than you almost produce. Mm-hmm. And number two is way behind you, not even close. So why go out there and make a change and say, we're going to stop this? The Coca-Cola people, I think back to 100 years ago, that if you'd bought stock in Coca-Cola,
oh Lord,
if you'd bought stock in Ford or General Motors or something, it'd gone real to the top, and then it went down some, But I can't think of too many stocks that you could have bought in 1925 that would make you rich today, other than Coca-Cola. And you take Microsoft wasn't around, and Dell Computer wasn't around. None of
the blue chips that are out there now, they weren't.
They weren't invented until NVIDIA and Netflix. They weren't even around the block.
Apple.
And very few stocks you can look at 100 years ago. You wish you had bought them, and that would have been a good purchase.
And hung on to them.
Yeah,
buy and hold.
Coca-Cola, they've split so many times. It's just unbelievable that if you had what your worth would be worth today in billions of dollars, billions of dollars. But they made a mistake, and they were big enough they could recover from it. Lots of times people make a mistake, and the business can't recover from it. But they were big enough they could recover from it, and they got to change. The emotional thing is not what they anticipated. They thought, we took this test, and everybody said, well, it tastes better. Mm-hmm. Grade A or grade B. And they said, B, that's a new one. So they said, well, everybody's going to love it. They announce it and start serving. Everybody goes, we don't want it.
People don't like change.
No, they don't like change, especially if they've been drinking something for 20 years or, the other may be sweeter, but that doesn't mean they want to give up what they've been drinking. I noticed a study came out last week. It said parents of a new baby, firstborn, will take 1,000 pictures in the first year. Now, I've known grandmothers that'll take 1,000 pictures in the first day. 1,000 pictures in the first year is about 3 a day. Mm-hmm. It's not that big a deal. But they have less pictures of that second and third. And Tubby Smith, he was one of 17. I imagine they didn't have any pictures after about number 8. They rarely got their picture made. But 17, he had 7 older brothers and sisters and 7 younger. And all of them did well. Did extremely well.
I'm curious. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and her whole life from the day she was born until today has been completely documented in photos. And I look back at my childhood, and you probably look back at yours. There's about 3 photos of me from when I was a kid, and
there were
no
a few,
video.
But hey, we didn't have 1,000. We didn't have 100.
Right.
It was a big deal to take a picture, and if you had a Kodak, that was a big deal. Kodak's another company that was just, their stock was unbelievably high and everything, and they didn't make adjustments, and it went to zero almost.
Yeah.
And they didn't stay on top of things. You got to anticipate what's going to be coming up, and if you're not paying attention, it's just, what was the book? I'm trying to think of the videos you could rent a
Blockbuster.
Yeah. Blockbuster. And, they went from, their stock was great. Everybody loved them. You'd have to get in line to get something. And within a year, they were history.
Netflix killed them.
Yeah. Somebody, hey, when you go to bed at night, if you've got a good, strong company, remember, there's somebody out there trying to figure out a way to do a better service and put you out of business.
Faster and cheaper.
And faster and cheaper. And you better be on top of it. You better stay on top of it. Also, I noticed there was a guy in Ireland, went to a bachelor party and lost his car. And it took him 3 months to find it. And he had to advertise and had to get on radio stations and talk about where he'd last seen it and everything. And pretty embarrassing to lose your car. And then there was a USPS driver stopped where they were having a party, had to deliver some packages, and started taking vodka shots.
Oh, Lord.
And got a DWI.
While driving the mail truck?
Yeah, and so it ended their career. Mail truck people said, we don't want you anymore.
That's a good job, too. Good benefits.
Good job.
Yeah.
There was a study that came out that said that the riskiest drivers are known to eat things while they're driving that are difficult, that are risky. They're even more risky. And the two that got me was soup. Now, how do you eat a bowl of soup when you're driving a car? And the other one was ribs. How are you going to eat ribs and not stick to the steering wheel? And, I thought somebody, they shouldn't be out there driving. Every once in a while, I'll see somebody going real slow, and you pull up to pass them, everything, and they've got their iPhone out, and it always burns me.
It does me too.
Put it in the holder, and use your sound system to say, call Sandy, call somebody. You can do that, but if you're reading emails, that's dangerous. Don't do it.
I pulled up next to a guy on I-35. He's going kind of slow, so I went around him. I looked over. He was eating a foot-long chili cheese dog from Sonic. Couldn't believe it. It's like, wow, that's
not
risky.
good.
Dangerous.
Very dangerous. Saying of the day is freedom lies in being bold. Robert Frost said that. He's right. Without courage, you're going to lose freedom. Thanks for listening, and be sure and look at the library. We have some good programs in there, some of the interviews. We had good interviews last week with the chairman of the Budget Committee, Jody Arrington, congressman from the 19th Congressional District, Lubbock and Abilene area.